Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. This is Megan from Modern Moon Quilt Studio. Today I'm going to show you how to make these fun and easy quilted placemats that'll be perfect for your dining table. And make sure to check out the bonus video where I'm going to show you how to make these coordinating cloth napkins. Let's start by going over everything we'll need to make these quilted placemats. If you want a more detailed breakdown of all the supplies and materials, as well as fabric requirements, make sure to check out the blog post that I'll link in the description below. For this project, you're going to need 2 fat quarters for each placemat that you plan to make. I'm doing a Valentine's Day placemat, so I'm using this fun print for the top of the placemat and then this solid red for the back. This bright pink I'm going to use for the binding. If you want something a little more sturdier, opt for a canvas or a duck cloth. You're also going to need some coordinating thread. I have this Aurifil cotton 50 weight thread in red, bright pink, and this ivory to match my fabrics. You're also going to need quilt batting. This is a perfect project to use up any spare batting you may have left over from other projects. If your batting isn't large enough to make your placemats, you can create larger pieces of batting by butting the edges together and sewing them together with a wide zigzag stitch. Trust me, no one will know. And of course, you're going to need a rotary cutter, a cutting mat, and a ruler. I would suggest a 24-inch ruler. You're also going to need something to mark your placemat before quilting. I'm going to use this Hera marker, but you can also use an air-soluble marker. And you're going to need something to baste these quilt layers together. Since it's a smaller project, I would suggest a basting spray, but you can also use pins if that's what you have on hand. Now comes the fun part. Let's start cutting down our fabric. I want my finished placemats to be 14 inches by 19 inches. So I'm going to cut both my pieces of fabric and my batting slightly larger. I'm going to go with 14.5 by 19.5 inches. So it gives me a little bit of wiggle room for the sewing and quilting, and then we'll trim everything down to the finished size after we finished quilting. The next thing we need to do is baste all of these layers together. I'm going to be using this adhesive basting spray, but you can use basting pins or large safety pins if that's what you have on hand. But because this is a smaller project, I just feel like the basting spray is a little more efficient. So start by laying your backing fabric right side down on a flat surface and giving it a good coat of the basting adhesive. Then you're going to lay the batting on top of that, making sure to cover all of the backing fabric and smoothing everything to make sure you're eliminating any wrinkles or ripples in the fabric. Then we're going to go ahead and spray the batting again with the basting spray, and we're going to lay the top fabric on top of that right side up. And make sure you're repeating the smoothing process, making sure you want this to be as smooth as possible. You don't want any wrinkles or ripples in your fabric. It's just going to make quilting this a lot easier and make the finished product look a lot nicer and smoother. I also flip it over one more time and give the backing fabric one more smooth because it does tend to get a little bit wrinkled when you are layering the batting and the fabric on top of that. The next thing we need to do is get this placemat ready for quilting. So I'm going to do a fun diagonal pattern on this, just using straight lines at a 45-degree angle. I'm using my 24-inch ruler and a Hera marker to mark these lines at, like I said, 45 degrees, and I'm marking them 2 inches apart. And I'm going to repeat that all the way across the placemat. Once we have all of our quilting lines marked, we need to take this to the sewing machine and get it quilted. You'll see that I'm not using a walking foot, but if you have a walking foot, that is a great option to help feeding all those layers through the sewing machine, but a standard presser foot is just fine for this project. I'm using Aurifil's 50 weight cotton thread in an ivory color on the top and then a red thread on the bottom or in the bobbin so that my thread is coordinating with the top and the bottom fabric. Once I had that first set of lines quilted, I went back and marked a second set of lines perpendicular to the first, but I made these lines about 4 inches apart rather than 2 inches apart. So it created this really fun and modern rectangle pattern on my placemats. Then I just took it back to the sewing machine and quilted that second set of lines, and this was really quick and easy since it was about half the lines. And like I said, just running those perpendicular to the first set. Now that we have our placemat quilted, we need to trim up the edges and get everything square. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I wanted my finished placemats to be 14 by 19 inches, so that's what we're going to go with. And I'm just using my long ruler, a rotary cutter, and a cutting mat to trim up the edges here. The final step in making these placemats is attaching our binding, and that starts with creating our binding strips. I like to use 2¼ inch strips of fabric that I'll sew together end to end on a diagonal. I'll then fold that in half lengthwise and give it a good press to create one long strip of binding. Next, you need to attach the binding by sewing it to the front side of the placemat. You do this by lining up the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of the placemat and sewing along the edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to create mitered corners with my binding. To do this, you'll stop about a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the placemat, stop and backstitch and cut your string. You'll then turn your placemat about 90 degrees so that you can continue sewing along the next edge. But before that, you need to fold the binding strip away from you at about a 45-degree angle and give it a quick finger press, and then fold it back towards you at about a 90-degree angle to create that mitered corner. You can pin this or clip this in place, but then you're going to continue sewing on the next edge of the placemat, starting at the very edge, making sure to backstitch before continuing on with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn all the way around your placemat and you have about 6 to 8 inches gap, we need to connect those ends. So to do that, we need to stretch out our two end pieces. And we need to cut these so that they overlap. And you want your overlap to be the same width as the original width of your binding strips. So that means when I made my strips of binding, I used 2¼ inch strips of fabric. So I need these two ends to overlap by 2¼ inches. And I found that it helps to give the fabric a little bit of stretch before cutting, because if there is too much slack in that fabric, your binding will end up rippling when you go to sew it and attach it to the placemat. So there you can see that I'm measuring that out at 2¼ inches. We'll mark that and cut it, and then I will show you how to attach these two ends. So to connect these two ends of binding at a 45-degree angle like we did our other binding strips, you need to first open up your binding strips and then lay them on top of each other, right sides together, at a 90-degree angle. So this can get a little tricky. You usually have to kind of fold the placemat in half or crumple it up a bit to get the ends to meet together, and I would suggest pinning these in place as well. I've done this enough I can get away with not pinning it, but you want to sew on the diagonal from corner to corner or from point to point at a 45-degree angle. And then once that's sewn, I would suggest before cutting off the excess fabric just opening this up and making sure that it's all attached correctly and folding correctly, because I have definitely messed it up in the past where the binding ends up twisted. So make sure you have that right. Trim off the excess so you're leaving just a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then continue sewing this binding to the front of the placemat, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end, and then I will show you how to fold it over and then attach it to the back. Now that we have our binding sewn to the front of the placemat, we need to flip this over and attach it to the back of the placemat. One of the first things I want to point out is this row of stitching that's about a quarter of an inch from the raw edge of the placemat. That's the stitching from attaching the binding to the front. So we want to cover that stitching with the binding by folding the binding over this edge and covering it by about 1/8 of an inch, or even closer to a 1/4 of an inch is good margins. And then you can clip this in place or pin it in place, and you can actually even glue baste this if that works for you. And if you're not familiar with glue basting, that involves running a really thin bead of washable school glue, like Elmer's glue, down uh, where you want the stitching to be, and then you set it with a hot iron, and that will hold this binding in place so that it can then be stitched. But I like to use these Wonder Clips. I think these work really well, and I only use 4 or 5 at a time, and then I just move them along as I'm sewing. And we are finally at the very last step of making these placemats. So to attach the binding, we're going to go back to the front of the quilt. So you're stitching on the front side of the quilt. And we are going to use a technique that's called stitch in the ditch. So what that means is you're going to drop the needle right in the seam of where you attach the binding. So right in that fold, or it's called a ditch. And you're going to run that row of stitches right down as close to that binding as you can get, while keeping that binding folded underneath the back side of the placemat. So as I fold this over, let's look at the back side, and you can see how that stitching looks. Now to round this corner, you want to slowly stitch up to the very inner point of that binding, and you're going to drop the needle in the down position, lift the presser foot up, and then rotate the placemat 90 degrees, and drop the presser foot, and then continue stitching in the ditch as close to that binding as you can. So as we round that last corner and finish up this placemat, don't forget to backstitch at the end as well as the beginning to make sure everything is locked in place. And with that, your quilted placemat is finished. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure to check out the sister video to learn how to make cloth napkins to coordinate with these awesome quilted placemats.